It's still quite early for you, John. So thank you so much for accepting our invitation. So welcome to this webinar on the 2020 US election and the aftermath for transatlantic relations. So a very hot topic, and perhaps we don't have all the information that we need to answer questions, but we can make a start. So my name is Sarah Leonard, and I'm Professor of International Security at the University of the West of England in Bristol, and I will be chairing this talk today. So our main speaker is John Occhipinti. So it's a great pleasure to welcome John, who is Professor of Political Science and Department Chair at Canisius College in his hometown of Buffalo in the state of New York. And John is one of the most qualified people we could think of to comment on this topic, given all the work he has done over the last few years on cooperation, on international security matters, and on transatlantic relations. And in addition to teaching at Canisius College, John has also been an adjunct professor at George Washington University in the master's degree program on Homeland Security for a few years. So it's a great pleasure to have you with us, John, and we very much look forward to hearing your thoughts. And as a discussant and also a contributor with a few questions of his own, we are delighted to also welcome Christian Kaunert, who is Chair of Policing and Security, as well as Director of the International Center for Policing and Security at the University of South Wales. And his own research is also on international security cooperation amongst European states, but also globally. So how European states and the European Union seek to cooperate with various countries around the world, and obviously notably the United States, one of the prime partners for European states and for the European Union in security, but also in a lot of other matters. So just a bit of housekeeping first. So John will first offer some comments and reflections on the events that are unfolding at the moment. And then Christian will have a couple of questions to kick us off. And then, of course, we will try and answer as many questions from the chat box. So you can see on the right-hand side of your screen a chat box. So if you could all use it to type in your questions, and I will be monitoring and then ask John the most popular questions. So please don't hesitate to type in the chat box just as we go along. So without any further ado, John, you have the floor for a few comments and reflections on the events of the last few hours, and also, I guess, on the events of the last 3 years, and perhaps some thoughts about what the future may hold for transatlantic relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, Christian and Joanna. It's my pleasure to speak to all of you. Thank you for joining me this afternoon. Here in Buffalo, believe it or not, on this November 4th day, it's sunny and it's supposed to be nice and warm. But the weather in Michigan and Wisconsin, so to speak, is a little bit more uncertain as I sit here with one eye really on the screen and my other eye trying to stay off of the television screen behind my computer that is showing the results. I can give you some initial updates, I think, and a little bit of overview of what's going on in case your busy day there, you haven't been following it as I followed it this morning. It's not actually terribly early here. It's only 9 o'clock. The trouble was that I was up very late, hoping that I'd have some clarity on something, and of course none came. So it's really just about being up late rather than being up early. So first of all, politically speaking, let me just start with a couple of political and then philosophical thoughts, and then I'll get to the direct topic at hand. So politically in the US, it was a disappointing night for the Democrats concerning the Senate. There had been high hopes that the Democrats would take back the US Senate, and this is not going to happen. And a lot of money was spent, a lot of time was spent on these campaigns and so forth. in various races, and it seems to have made little difference. So we are going to have divided government of a kind in the U.S. The House is not flipped over to Republicans, so the Congress will still be divided, which means that the government will still not function as efficiently as it could, which might not be a bad thing depending on how the presidential race turns out, I suppose. But that's in Congress. I know the big news, of course, is the president. Now, there's been an unprecedented amount of voting by mail in the United States this year due to COVID, due to people's concerns for waiting in long lines. There was early voting. Some of that was actually in person, but a lot of the early voting was by mail, by absentee ballot, and that's in fact how I voted. And that's unusual for the United States. I know in some countries in Europe, voting by mail is quite common. Other places it's not so common. But voting by mail here is not very common. And in fact, sometimes when you vote absentee, you realize, well, maybe my vote's really not even going to be looked at because the race is going to be decided before they look at those absentee ballots. But that's in fact what's going on now, and delaying final results in several U.S. states is they're counting the absentee ballots. And by law in those states, they were required to wait until after the other votes were counted before they could even start counting all the absentee ballots. And on top of that, they're just not staffed and set up to do this. So it's taking a long time. It's really, I think, kind of embarrassing about how badly we are running another one of our elections in this regard. There should be a better way of doing this. Certainly COVID was not a surprise. There was plenty of advance notice, but yet I think a lot of it is staffing issues and outdated technology and so forth. And all of this is handled on a state-by-state basis. There are no national standards for this. So, I'm looking at a television screen here now that says that Vice President Biden has 224 electoral votes of the 270 that he needs, and President Trump has 213 of the 270 he needs. So if either one reaches 270, they will be inaugurated as president, or President Trump will stay president. I would say right now it still looks more favorable for Vice President Biden than for President Trump, if I had to say one way or the other. And here's why. If Vice President Biden holds on to his lead in Arizona, holds on to his lead in Wisconsin, takes essentially most of Maine's votes. Maine is one of the two states where it's not a winner-take-all system, and he overtakes President Trump in Michigan, which seems likely actually. Then he does not need to win in Alaska, North Carolina, or Georgia, or even Pennsylvania to reach 270 votes. And the reason why the gap has closed from over 220,000 votes when I woke up this morning to less than 20,000 votes now in Michigan is because where they are counting those absentee ballots in Michigan are in cities, counties where there are a lot more Democrats than Republicans. So most of these votes are going to be votes for Democrats. So in general, most of the votes that are coming in now most of the votes that are being counted now, these absentee votes, are going to go to the Democrats. And I'm only guessing here, but I think there's two reasons for this, and this is the guessing part. I think that the Democrats in the U.S. took COVID more seriously than the Republicans. They were more concerned about things like social distancing and being stuck in lines and in confined spaces when they were voting. And they went ahead and voted absentee or by mail for that reason. I think also Democrats are more trusting of the process. They are less prone to some of the conspiracies about what might happen to their votes if they were simply mailed in. And they don't have as many concerns about a deep state, let's say. So they voted more heavily absentee than the Republicans. So now the absentee votes that are being counted in all these states, a lot of these are Democratic votes. And so this is why people seem optimistic that Vice President Biden can overtake President Trump in Michigan. and hold on to his lead. In Wisconsin, his votes come in from urban areas like Milwaukee, for example. And even in Georgia, I suppose it's still possible because a lot of the votes there are coming in from the Fulton County where Atlanta is. And it's also very heavily Democratic. And perhaps even in Pennsylvania, because again, a lot of the votes that are being counted are coming in from around Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, again, where Democrats tend to live. Now, I think that there could be calls for recounts. This is going to be very close. Wisconsin's a state where it's always been close in recent years. So this is nothing new about the election being razor close in Wisconsin. But when races are close, often candidates have the ability to justifiably call for a recount. That could delay things. There could be lawsuits. I think the most likely lawsuit could be filed by the president regarding Pennsylvania. There's some dispute there about whether or not Pennsylvania should be allowed to continue to accept absentee ballots that come in today, tomorrow, I think until Friday, as long as they were postmarked by Election Day. There's dispute about whether or not the election authorities have overstepped their bounds. By doing that, the court there has agreed with them, but that is a lawsuit that President Trump could file. It might not matter, so perhaps he won't file it because it won't matter either way, but that's one of the potential lawsuits that could come. So, and then, I'm sure a lot of you have been paying attention to the U.S. election, so I apologize if I'm telling you more than you need to be reminded of. But another point is that, in principle, there's lots of time to count all the votes. I think it's the third Wednesday after the third Friday after the third Monday after the first Wednesday in November is the date when votes have to be counted, and that's the date when each kind of state sort of says, okay, we've safely determined our count, and then the Electoral College, which is, by the way, a very terrible place to go and get a bachelor's degree or a Ph.D. You don't want to go there. It's very low quality. But the Electoral College doesn't even meet. I mean, the electors cast their votes in their states, and then those votes are transmitted to Congress, and then in January, then Congress has to certify the election. And then there's an inauguration, or if President Trump is the winner, there won't be, naturally anything happening. Nothing will change. So that's what's going on. So there's plenty of time, actually, but usually we're able to do this sooner. But now that we've become kind of a developing country when it comes to elections, this is how it's going to play out this year. We need to wait a few days, and people here are very concerned, I should say, about social unrest. We've had a lot of a whole summer of social unrest, as I'm sure you know, after the Floyd murder, and there's also so there's concerns about protests on the left and fringe groups on the left maybe acting violently, and then there's also concerns, of course, with militia groups on the right and their possible reaction. And President Trump's comments last night in the middle of the night, which I stayed up for, sort of indicating that the voting should stop, which was very odd since the voting has, of course, stopped. It had stopped by then, but I think a lot of people could take that as, he mentioned something about votes showing up in the middle of the night, which of course is not the case. But all of this is sort of what people were afraid of, that he would play into people's concerns that there's some kind of cheating going on, some kind of conspiracy going on. And so if Vice President Biden reaches 270 Electoral College votes, there could be a lot of people who are Trump supporters who may not accept this and believe that some kind of shenanigans were going on. On the left, I suppose people could say that voter suppression in a few places has hurt the elections. People who wanted to vote couldn't vote, et cetera. But I think likely there's going to be just more anger on the left than sort of a view that there was cheating going on. And I think on the right, should Vice President Biden win, there'll be both the anger and a sense of, this election was stolen from us. So that's sort of the political situation. Philosophically, as an American, I care a lot about, as a political scientist and as a teacher, I care a lot about democracy. I talk a lot about it in my classes. I think a lot about it. I think it's positive in a way that there was more interest in this election than in the past. I think turnout probably is going to end up being higher than it was ever in the past. Turnout in the last election was a bit lower than the previous one when President Obama when President Obama was elected. But we're still low. I mean, so that said, turnout's better, but by European standards, by most countries in Europe, our turnout of people who really could register to vote and then vote is only around 60%, and that's low. Now, granted, some countries in Europe, like Belgium, have a requirement that you must vote, and so their turnout is very high for that reason. But I think it would be high anyhow, as it is in other places in Europe. So if you look at the U.S. compared to OECD countries, we have very low turnout, and that goes to, I think, a lack of a sense of political efficacy here, and a lack of feeling that either one of the two parties really listens to them, really stands for them. So I think we're weaker in political culture than I think we could be. I think our campaigns are way too long, also compared to other countries, industrialized democracies. I mean, this has been going on since June of 2019. It's unbelievable. The decision was made about who would be in the first Democratic debates for long before there were any of the primaries in June of 2019. Imagine this. So we spend a tremendous amount of money. And here's the point. I don't think we're any better educated for it as Americans. I think we're getting dumber as a country, not smarter for all of this. I think this is mostly just a lot of theater. I don't think the media is helping very much by simply covering this theater rather than covering actual issues in our country, actual issues in the world. That gets us closer to our topic for today. Social media, I think, has certainly helped spread misinformation, spread conspiracy theories. I think some of the platforms now are starting to realize this and have gotten more involved about controlling what shows up on their platforms. But given our tradition of free speech and some of our laws, this has been perceived as controversial in some eyes, although the free speech protections that we have really pertain to the government, not to private companies like Facebook or Twitter. I think if President Trump should win, also, and I'll conclude with the philosophical remarks with this, that this would be really dangerous for our democracy. I don't think he'd have really anything to lose. He would feel really unrestricted in terms of what he attempts to do with his presidential power. And I think he would continue to try to erode the rule of law here, and also continue to divide the country with his rhetoric. Now to the questions at hand. Well, I'm afraid if President Trump wins, we're going to get more of the same. And what does that mean? So I think we need to consider both here the internal security issues that I have a lot of expertise on, and the external security issues that I don't have as much, but I still, of course, pay attention to it. Both of those will be affected. So we need to kind of separate what we mean by security, right? It'll also, I think, continue to erode American leadership in various ways, and in cooperation with Europe in various ways. But all of that said, we need to separate rhetoric from reality. So just because President Trump tweets something out in the middle of the night about Europe or about Germany or whatever, doesn't necessarily mean that becomes U.S. policy, luckily. And we've seen this. So he may, have some crazy talk about NATO, or about the European Union, or about trade with Europe, and so forth. But that doesn't necessarily translate immediately into policy. Then if you look at sort of what's coming out of the State Department, it is more measured. It is more sort of like previous presidents who've taken a more of a unilateral road rather than a multilateral road in their diplomacy. So again, always be careful to separate the rhetoric of President Trump from actually what's happening and the actual change that's resulting from this. But that said, and I know I have a lot of caveats here, but I think that does erode America's power. It does erode America's leadership. I'm sure that most of the audience is familiar with this concept of soft power. And America's leadership depends not only on its hard power, including its military and its large economic market and resources, but also its ability to attract others to its values, to its image, and like any leader. And I think we've certainly lost a lot of this in recent years. I don't think President Obama really lived up to all of Europeans' expectations, that's for sure. But on the other hand, he didn't actively work to erode America's soft power either. Whereas President Trump is definitely doing this in most of Europe, at least. I think maybe views on President Trump are different in Eastern Europe, parts of Eastern Europe, than in Western Europe. I think one big difference is that I think more Americans now are paying more attention to Russia as a potential threat and concern than they were at the very start of President Obama's first term. So I think sort of the perception of the importance of Europe has definitely changed back to being a little bit more important than it used to be. There was, as you probably will recall, a time when the US was attempting to pivot to Asia and away from Europe. But then suddenly, it became clear that Russia under Putin is not a friend of most countries that are democratic. And I think that that's a reality that, has made Europe once again important for the United States. Now, if President Biden wins, I think we will certainly get a change in the rhetoric. We'll certainly get a change in the policy style. There will be a new group of people working with Europeans on various issues. Now, I should say that I know a couple of people, and Sarah and Christian know some of the same people in U.S. government who are continuing working under President Trump and are very reasonable people. And so it's not like the whole U.S. government over the last 4 years has been filled with maniacs, all just like President Trump. A lot of the same reasonable people are still around and still been working and doing their best. And I think that the Europeans that they are working with on various issues, whether it be on immigration issues or fighting terrorism or NATO, are still the same, sort of reasonable people. And there's, a lot more cooperation going on, I think, under the radar than sometimes the headlines would indicate. But there's a lot at stake. There's a lot of issues where I think the U.S. Could be better. I think one big example was, 4 years ago in 2016, actually over 4 years ago now, President Trump was very vocal in his support of Brexit. And, from time to time, people like me here are put on local television just as they need somebody to, seems like they know what they're doing, to look good or something, or sound good. I don't know if I look good, but to sound good, to legitimize what they want to say. And one reporter actually asked a really good question. He said, what does the increasing support, this was in June of 2016, what does the increasing support, the growing support for Mr. Trump, with then candidate Trump, have in common with the recent positive Brexit vote in the UK? And I said, be careful what you wish for. And I think that is still true today. I don't think the U.S. is better off with President Trump, and I don't think that, I'll put my cards on the table here, I don't think that the UK is better off being out of the EU, and I don't think the EU is better off with the UK out. I think it's a total lose situation, and it's also not in America's interest. So I'm hoping that a presidency under Mr. Biden will reinvigorate America's support for European integration, see it as a positive thing, see the potential for cooperation, muddle through the kinds of mini crises that we will experience over things like the digital economy and privacy laws and some rules about travel and cooperate on important things like the fight against cross-border crime and terrorism and so forth. So I'm hopeful that the weather will turn out to be sunny today in Michigan and Wisconsin, and that this will also mean a brighter future for transatlantic relations. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, John. A lot of food for thought, definitely. So, and a lot of questions already in the box, so please keep them coming. But before John starts answering them, perhaps we will ask Christian whether he's got a couple of comments or perhaps burning questions to ask John.
Right. Well, hi, John. Thanks for being here with us. I think it's a great opportunity to have you here. And it's just so nice to be able to discuss these kind of questions with you, because you're such a fountain of knowledge on these things. I think it's really very interesting also for all the people that have come to our event. Your talk was already very comprehensive and very deep on a number of issues. So, you're not leaving me so many red meat issues that I can probe you on. But
well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that, because you're smarter than me, Christian. So if I said that, if I stole some of your thunder, that means I must have said something intelligent. So, that you can just ask me a question. Feel free.
No, I mean, that's great. I mean, I think I'll ask one or two questions about the election itself, and then just a couple of things in terms of the larger geopolitics that is there. Now, in terms of the way the night kind of developed at the beginning, it was starting to look like, President Trump had done much better than what was expected. And in fact, even now, President Trump still has done a lot better than what most of the opinion polls expected.
Yes.
But what we saw throughout the night was that in many cases, what was quite an advantage for him in the early counting of the votes turned to become a disadvantage as the absentee ballots were counted and so on, and in fact could eventually turn out to be the pathway to a possible presidency by President Biden. Now, one of the important moments, I guess, during the night that I think most people have been discussing also globally was when President Trump declared, I believe that I've won the elections, right? A number of people commented, well, this is unprecedented that anybody had possibly prematurely declared that they were the winner. It was also astonishing the kind of moment at which it was declared, because it was just after Arizona was called for former Vice President Biden by Fox News of all networks, and of course the Trump people reacted furiously at Fox as if Fox was their main enemy, in fact. So I was curious what your thoughts were, because my impression at that point was the reaction can only, because in a lot of states, the picture was unclear. So you could not reasonably think that by that point you have won the election. So my gut feeling was, does he know he's losing actually? And that's why this was being declared.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Those are two good questions. So you have, in fact, given me a couple of things to say that I didn't. So first of all, on your last question, I was also staying up late waiting for this speech, and then trying to wind down after it and digest what I just saw and heard, which was incredible. Something interesting about that, I did see on one of the networks afterwards as they were breaking down his speech. I think at that time, I was switching networks all night to try to just see how they were calling different states, and some networks were more cautious than others. I think Fox actually was the least cautious about calling states. And then I was watching PBS, our public broadcasting system, that was using, I think, Associated Press data and projections and so forth, and reports to call states. And I was watching, of course, CNN, which had, of course, its crazy map. and MSNBC. But one reporter noted that they had set up teleprompters in the room where the President Trump made his speech. And in the end, the teleprompters were never used. And this tells me that, and it's told this reporter, and I think this is probably true, I mean, we may never know, that there were prepared remarks that were more balanced and more cautious for the president to read off the teleprompter. And instead, he decided to be President Trump and just start talking. And I think what came out was this feeling inside him that this can't be happening, and I must be being robbed, and there's going to be, people are going to take to the streets. Now, in a couple of days leading up to the election, there were reports that he had said something like this, that he was going to declare victory even before it was clear. And then the day before or the morning of the election, he said in an interview, I wouldn't do that. But then I think when the moment came at 2:00 in the morning, this post-COVID older man, probably tired, probably nervous, instead of reading the speech that his advisors had urged him to give, he just did what he normally does in the middle of the night when he's tweeting. He went nuts and said all these crazy things about how, the voting should stop, and I think I've won, and what's going on, and I think this is exactly what people had been concerned about. It's exactly why, it's crazy in America to see leading up to the election, people boarding up businesses, the White House being turned into some kind of a fortress with double, triple fencing. I mean, it's embarrassing, and it's amazing at the same time that this is how we're preparing for an election. What kind of a country prepares for an election this way, right? I mean, it's certainly not the country I want the United States to be. So, yeah, I think and it wasn't fact Fox. I was also watching all these channels, and it wasn't fact Fox that had called Arizona. It wasn't the deep state. It wasn't MSNBC. It was Fox. So that was pretty incredible. And that also just worries me. I mean, if he does in fact win, he's not going to feel what does he have to lose? And with the Justice Department under his control, I think things could get worse, which is a scary thought. Now, that said, I think there's a lot of serious professionals in the United States who care about the Constitution, who care about democracy. These include people in the U.S. military. The U.S. military has the highest level of trust of any public institution in the United States, and perhaps rightly so. Now, interestingly, Americans tend to like their individual members of Congress, but Congress as a whole as an institution has very, very low levels of trust. And if you're interested in this, the Pew Research Center has good data on this, and so does Gallup. And that brings me to the polling, because you mentioned polling at the start. I would be very worried if I were in the polling business this morning. Once again, the polls were not terribly accurate. I'm not an expert at polling, but I do know now that there's been 2 elections when the polls have been off. And I would not be wanting to pay for this product if it was even worse than the weatherman's ability to predict whether or not we're going to have rain tomorrow. And they might, when they come on sometimes and say, there's a 50% chance of showers tomorrow, sometime before 8 o'clock. Well, thanks a lot. That's great. That's pretty much every day if it's Buffalo in November, right? And maybe the same for Wales in the winter. So if the polls are no good, I don't know. I think we have to do. If I were a pollster right now, I'd be really re-examining how we do polls. Now, there was one interesting point leading up to the election. There's a think tank in the United States. It tends to be libertarian in its political views, So a combination of both social liberalism and economic liberalism. It's called the Cato Institute. And Cato had done its own poll, which indicated that about 62% of conservatives tend to lie in polls. So a lot of my friends who are on the right, or people I encountered on Facebook, let's say I'm old, so I still use Facebook. Sorry, students. They would say, oh, well, don't trust the polls because most conservatives don't tell the truth in polls. But what the irony was that they were relying on a poll to make this claim. So I didn't know what to make of it. Like, well, which poll are they lying in? But in fact, the polls were wrong again in many places. It's much closer than the polls would have indicated. So I think this is in the United States, at least, I think this is an important moment for how polls are done and how polls are used in presidential elections. I think after two kind of failed attempts, I think there could be a change in that industry. The only caveat I have for that is that it seems Vice President Biden may have knew more than what the polls were saying, because he campaigned in places where he thought he really did have a shot, and he stayed away from, say, Texas. And some of the polls are saying he had a shot to win Texas, and he stayed away from Texas. And so I think there are some people who understand the polls and what they mean and what they don't mean, what they can tell us and what they can't. And I think maybe at some level, talking to people on the ground, talking to people at the local level, contacts in the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania, let's say, I think that still matters, not just the raw data, because the raw data has been wrong. Now, let's see how things turn out. I mean, throughout the day, I've heard that Michigan, by the end of the day, may be done with its count. Wisconsin as well. So we may have a little news there. I think Pennsylvania could take longer. A lot of these people are up late last night, and then they're back up again. I've heard stories. I saw a story on CNN about, this will kind of be a metaphor. One of the issues that was delaying things this morning in Michigan in one county was that they were looking for ink for the inkjet printer to, I'm not sure if it was a dot matrix printer or what kind of printer it was, but they were looking for ink so they could print stuff out so they could continue with the count. I mean, this is crazy that, this is kind of how we are conducting our election. When you're running around like, you go to the store and get us some ink because we're out, I'm embarrassed. It's nice to crack jokes, and I guess it's better than crying, but we should be able to do better than this as a country. I'm a sports fan, as Christian and Sarah know, and my local team here often makes me cry, and sometimes you have to just live with it and be hopeful, and so I'm hopeful, and I'm trying not to cry. It's very much like watching my American football team, all the time. We're having a good season this year, so that makes me optimistic. So I don't know, so maybe things will turn out okay. I don't know.
Thanks a lot, John. Yeah, let's hope that's a good omen.
Yes.
So there are a lot of questions in the box. I'm going to try and group some of them. So first of all, perhaps we've talked quite a lot about the presidential aspect of the election, but could you say a little bit more about the other elections? Because that's also important, and that will be also important for whoever ends up in the White House.
Yeah, first I should say that if neither candidate reaches 270 votes, that this will be decided in the House of Representatives. And that is a possible scenario, which has never happened. So if it ends up in the House of Representatives, each state delegation of Congress people cast a vote for their state. So you need to win 26 states. It's a very odd system. And the Republicans would have the majority of the state delegation. So the Republicans would be able to elect President Trump. And meanwhile, our system has the Senate selecting the vice president. I mean, it's a very strange system. Almost never do we have to even talk about this, but in principle, it could be possible for us to end up with a president from one party and a vice president from another, right? I mean, this is how our crazy system is set up. So that's the one thing I wanted to say. But it still looks good for President Biden maybe to come through with the absentees. Yeah, so when it comes to Congress, the Democrats were not able to make the kind of inroads that they wanted to. The leadership of the Senate's going to stay the same. I am not sure if the leadership of the House will stay the same under Congresswoman Pelosi because of the failure of the Democrats to make inroads. So this could be a sign of her weakness, a sign that there needs to be change. So we could see some changing of the leadership there on the House side. You know, we don't have a seniority system anymore like we did years ago. So since the Nixon years, so you know the leadership of the committees and the leadership of the parties in both chambers could change. One thing that's been sort of disheartening is that over the last 4 years, at least for me, I have, you know, again, put my cards on the table. Obviously, I'm a Democrat. I think you can probably tell. Is that you know, the Republican Party has gone along with President Trump. They really have been afraid of standing up to President Trump on a variety of issues, including things like racism and things that we think would be a no-brainer for them to say, all right, well, you know, on this issue, we have to really say that the president is off base. And I think this result will only embolden them, I think, to sort of say, well, you know, especially if President Trump wins, you know, it worked. You know, we were able to hang on to Congress or hang on to the Senate. We've got another 4 years to wait for another Supreme Court justice to retire or pass away, and we can, you know, we can really make over the court. And I think if President Trump wins, there will be a couple of retirements, and younger conservative justices will be appointed. And so the court has really been affected by this. I think you can see in Europe right now how, and that was done, I think, more or less illegally, but we'll see how the court matters in a place like Poland. You know, where here it's done legally, but you might not like it, but at least it's legal. In Poland, when they changed the retirement law and they stack the court there, I think that you know, we'll see now. This is becoming, as you know, a big hot issue. So so these elections matter for things like the court, and the Supreme Court is already changed now under President Trump. So. And this matters on a host of social issues. Of course, the abortion is the hot button issue here, as it is in Poland these days. And I think people are very concerned about the law, you know, the laws that are in place, the Supreme Court decisions that are in place changing now eventually. And there'd be nothing that even President Biden can do about this. You know, but then again, you know, sometimes you don't know how these justices are going to rule. So you might think they're going to rule one way because they happen to be appointed by a conservative president, but they may, you know, read the law a different way. They may actually exercise their judicial independence. When it comes to foreign policy, I think for years now, Congress has really given up its constitutionally provided role in balancing the president's power. And this is not just under President Trump. This is you know, sort of goes back now several presidencies where you have at the same time a breakdown of the foreign policy consensus in the United States since the Vietnam era, so this is nothing new. But you also have Congress really just kind of letting the president do what he wants to do and really not getting in his way. And that means not getting in his way when he deals with Europe on a variety of issues, or dealing with global issues like such as climate change. So and then the courts really in the United States stay out of the way when it comes to foreign policy. So the courts wouldn't step in, rarely step in and say the president has gone too far here. So presidents in the US have a lot of leeway when it comes to foreign policy, more than what you see in the Constitution in practice. Increasingly, they use executive agreements to organize their relations with foreign countries rather than treaties which need to go through the Senate. Increasingly, presidents of all kinds will put US military in harm's way and in conflicts, and Congress, won't invoke the powers that it has to limit them or to stop them. So presidents really have a leeway. And the problem with that is that Americans tend to be disinterested in foreign policy. And this goes to my point about, I don't know if we're any better off now after this long campaign. I don't think America, these various foreign policy issues that I've been mentioning so far this morning, I don't think really any of those are on the minds of voters yesterday or ahead of time via their mail-in ballots. They may have been thinking, the Republicans, I think, were thinking mostly about the economy and what a Republican administration would mean for their taxes and how the government spends its money. I think Democrats were concerned with COVID and racism, but foreign policy really wasn't on the radar for voters of either party. I partially blame the media. I tell my students all the time, do not use television to get your news. Use it for entertainment if you like, but don't use it to get your news. And I'm stressing more and more now to my students, you need to be active seekers of your news. You need to know which sites, which websites are reliable and which are unreliable, and you need to know their bias. They're all gonna have a little bit of bias, you just need to be aware of it. And ideally, you should only be looking at news sources that are known to be reliable, factual, not deliberately misleading, and you should be reading a little bit from the right, a little bit from the left, and I think that's the best we can do as citizens. But I think too many people these days are letting the news simply flow to them, and the more they click on the news that's flowing to them, the more they get more of that kind of news. And I think the media knows Americans don't care much about foreign policy, so I know that there are things going on in the world, but America doesn't. For example, I use this as a sad illustration in my classes all the time. I've been talking about it for months now. I look at my class and I say, do you know that for the last several months, there's been a migrant and refugee crisis going on in the Mediterranean? And they have no idea. They have no idea that this is even happening. It's because if they're getting their news from Twitter or they're watching our television networks, it's not on. It's nowhere to be found. And this is a real, as you know, I mean, you're the leading expert in the field, I would say. This is a big deal. It's a big problem, and it's nowhere to be found in our news. And it's actually an issue where I think Europe and the United States have a lot of similarities, where you have sort of an enduring situation with push and pull factors that's going to mean that there's going to be migratory pressure and refugees trying to come into the EU, trying to come into the United States. This is not going to go away, and I think countries need to find the right way to handle this. And so this will be an area where the two sides really could communicate and try to find sort of the right, maybe you might call it a global consensus on how to deal with this problem. And we're a long way from doing that right now, I think. I mean, Europe itself, I think, is having a hard time finding a consensus. And then there's certainly, without that, we have no consensus here in the United States. And then the two sides are not really, I don't think really learning a lot from each other. I think at a technical level they are, I know that, the US still works with Europe a lot on some technical issues, entry exit, for example. I still think there's a lot of learning in both directions going on. PNR issues and so forth. There's been a lot of actually cooperation at a very technical level, I think. But on these broader issues that citizens are sort of looking at, we may know that there's a refugee or migration issue in the United States in our southern border, but we have no idea that it's happening in Europe. And so why should we expect politicians to care about it if their voters don't care about it? So why should we expect people in Congress to say a lot about foreign policy if they know their voters at the end of the day really don't care, really don't know? And that brings up a lot of issues for democracy then, So let's say we did have good polling about what Americans think. Well, should we trust what they think? I asked my students this yesterday. What does it mean for democracy if you've got a public that's misinformed or lacks information, and yet they express a view on something? Should politicians be following that, listening to that, or should they be doing what they think is best because they may know more? I mean, it sounds kind of elitist, but sometimes experts do know more, and sometimes if you follow what the masses want, you end up making mistakes that you regret. And I think we see this a little bit in Europe, and I think we see this definitely in the United States.
Yes, absolutely. We had a lot of questions around that during all the debates following the EU and the Brexit referendum, and a lot of questions on whether members of parliament get a precise mandate or are there to take the best decision in the interest of their constituents. So that's certainly a debate we haven't solved, but we have heard a lot about that over the last few years.
Yes.
So another group of questions, and certainly after Donald Trump's intervention in the middle of the night, there were concerns around possible violence and also the polarization of society. So two interrelated issues there in a sense. So the first is the fact that Trump has done so well. We don't know whether he's going to stay in the White House or not, but he's done better than expected, better than what a lot of people expected. So what does that tell you about the polarization and also the influence of the far right in the US? So that would be the first question, I think. Okay. And then a related one is, so whoever ends up in the White House, how is the president going to deal with this clear division and this polarization of society? Because clearly some people actually like what Trump is saying, and other people are very shocked and feel very strong feelings against him. So what's the way forward when you have such a polarized society?
Well, I'll take the first question first because it's easier. So yeah, we are definitely more polarized than we used to be. You used to be able to say in my own teaching career, and I'm old, but I'm not that old, that, one difference between the American system and say most European systems is that you can have a lot of independence in Congress. You're not every vote is a party line vote. Because of our electoral system and the primary system, you can be independent of the party. You don't have to be on a list or something to win. But in fact, in recent years, it is almost all party line voting, and it's also affected and you're probably aware of this, it's affected the way we talk about politics. I mean, it's not just on social media where everybody is very brave and maybe you see their nastier side and they say things to people, kind of like when people flame out in emails and things. But still, when you can't even discuss with people, things. So it's very polarized here. This whole notion, and I think it kind of began with the Republicans, and not just President Trump, but the Republicans kind of dismissing climate change. And it's been going on for a while, as you know. I think that started this trend that is intensified under the Trump administration, that you're entitled to your own facts. There's really no such thing as experts. There's really no such thing as scientists who really know the issue. Everything is really up for grabs. And this is bad as well. So you've got very polarized views and values, I think, on the one hand. And on the other, at the same time, you've got people talking with different sets of facts, which makes dialogue almost impossible. If that, I think, is really a problem. The militia question, yes, this is, I think, especially if I think it's going to get worse either way. I think if President Trump wins, you're going to continue to see Americans saying and doing things that would have appeared inappropriate or embarrassing 5 or 10 years ago. But now they have somebody in the White House who is saying these things and seems to be encouraging these things, and they're going to think it's okay. I mean, people are saying things now that they never would have said 10 years ago. And I think it's sort of, it's almost like it's brought out their true feelings. Now they feel, thank goodness I can really say what I think, because all this talk about, equality, I never really bought that, and now I can really say what I think about people who don't look like me or don't practice my religion. Thank goodness, and I think this is only going to embolden some of those people if he should win. If he should lose, I think people are going to be angry. And I think you're going to see these militia groups become more active. We've already seen one sort of through a sting operation of the FBI, through an informant of the FBI, one operation to kidnap and potentially murder the governor of Michigan, be foiled by the FBI. I think you'll be seeing more of that. I think the FBI is going to have its hands full dealing with this. And I've alluded to this in a paper I'm thinking about for a conference that you and Christian are planning. So you may know what I'm about to say, but I think, in fact, this is going to make America more like Europe in a sense. Here's what I mean by that. And this is the first time I've ever kind of said this publicly, so I'm interested in getting some feedback and some criticism from your audience on this. But recently in Europe, we've seen a couple of deadly terrorist attacks again recently, last week, sadly, and on a small scale, but still terrible and potentially terrorizing for people. And there is a fringe group of people who use their faith. You can call them Islamists if you want, who are doing this, right? And the problem that Europe faces is that there's a lot of people who are of Muslim descent in Europe. They've been there for generations. Maybe they came as guest workers, maybe they came as migrants, maybe they came as refugees. They've been there for years. We're talking about, not just children, but grandchildren, as you know. They're in most European societies these days, not all, but most. And that makes it very difficult to handle, because how do you deal with terrorism when you've got a population that is all over the place, but you're really only worried about a very tiny radicalized portion of that population? How do you still have freedoms in society and liberty and so forth, and deal with that at the same time? I think in the United States, because these communities are fewer. I mean, there's one here in Buffalo, to the south of Buffalo. There was one of the original group that was arrested after 9/11. The Lackawanna Six was right here in Western New York. So a group of young men who traveled to an Al-Qaeda camp and met Osama bin Laden, and then realized, oh my goodness, this guy's a terrorist, and then came home, and then they end up getting arrested, and they're all out of jail now. There's a community in Detroit. There's pockets of this, but it's not as extensive. So in a way that makes it easier to deal with the United States, because there's just not as many communities. of people that you need to sort of examine. And it's easier to sort of find informants in various places and people that are, looking out for people who may be radicalized or maybe, do something bad. But now I think with this militia problem, who are we going to be looking for? White guys who are angry? Well, that's everybody, So, I mean, in a way that makes us more like Europe. Now, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with that and still have free speech? How do we deal with that and still have freedom of assembly? How is the FBI going to tell when somebody on social media has gone too far and needs to take action? I mean, there are, literally thousands of people in Europe who are traveling all the time back and forth to their countries of origin or where their families are, communicating all the time with their families. And, 99.9% of that is completely legitimate. And the same with these views of the right. I mean, you're going to have a lot of views of the right now and people gathering and people communicating and expressing themselves. And you know what? Under our Constitution, that's going to be, I'm not happy with it, but it's allowed. But how's the FBI going to know when one group is about to go too far and they need to take action to stop something from happening, or one person is about to go nuts who's just had it, and I think that makes it's going to make it much more challenging, this militia problem, for law enforcement to deal with. So now your second question on how to bring the country together. I don't know. I really, with these alternative facts that people seem to have, I think that's really problematic. If they really just view the world completely differently. Increasingly, there are these conspiracy theories, not just about Bigfoot, Sasquatch, but about, what's going on in the government, the deep state, and so forth. And so it's amazing that we are buying into these things. And there's no reasoning with people who believe these things. So if I were president, and I don't, if President Trump's elected, the country's not going to come together. If President Biden is elected, what he could at least try would be a real civic education program. I mean, President Trump has talked about this, but meaning his idea of civic education was, we need to think America is great. You should be teaching this more in the schools. He made a speech a few months ago. It's probably more for the campaign than anything else because the schools are handled at the state and local levels. But a real message of, as Americans, we need to learn more about what democracy really means, what's going on in the rest of the world, and that we do need to find some common ground to work together. There are some. So we do have a civic nation here in the United States. There are some values that we share, and try to stress those. Try to denounce violence when he sees it, and on both sides if it happens. And speaking of that, I think if President Trump should win, we are going to see a lot of demonstrations and some violence, but I don't think it's going to be different. It's going to be kind of what we saw like in the summer. It's not going to be sort of, I don't think Antifa represents the kind of terrorist threat per se that the right-wing militias do. I think it's much different. I think there are some people connected with that movement who are prone to violence, but I think it's much different. I think most of it's going to be protests and people just expressing their dissatisfaction or their anger. Whereas the militia problem, I think, is going to be, much more pervasive as a security threat.
Thank you, John. Christian, did you have any follow-up questions on what John has just been covering before we move on to other questions?
Yes, well, I just wanted to have one question that was kind of about geopolitics and in particular the transatlantic relationship.
Yep.
One of the things that I thought was quite curious was that, of course, just like in a sense the result in the morning was not very clear yet. We don't know yet who's going to win for sure. we already had a congratulatory message from an EU member state to President Trump. Of course, the Slovenian
Was this Hungary? I'm just guessing. Was it Hungary? Poland?
Close. No, it's Slovenia.
Okay.
Slovenia, of course, the Slovenian Prime Minister is also a close associate to Viktor Orban. In fact, his party is entirely financed by Viktor Orban's party. So there's a clear political link there. But what I was trying to think is, well, what does that mean for transatlantic relations? Because of course, on the one hand, you have America that seems to be divided, but of course, on the other hand, it's not as if Europe is totally just of one mind. So how is that going to, how is it going to be possible for transatlantic relations to become closer, in a sense, irrespective of who's going to sit in the White House, when, in a sense, both sides are going to find it difficult? I mean, I remember the times when in the US, it was common procedure that there were Republicans, Democrats always kind of working together in the Senate and on the House of Representatives. In the same way, at some point in the European Union, you had a sort of corps d'esprit in the EU institutions and a council, not to, for instance, outvote people and a certain kind of, and there's this polarization that's going on in the EU as well, where of course certain member states are not exactly in line with other member states anymore. So how are we going to come closer together when both sides seem to be internally more divided than ever?
Yeah, no, I think that that is one of the biggest challenges for Europe as an outside observer. Is this division? Is the leadership? Where's the leadership going to come from in the future for Europe? When Chancellor Merkel retires, for example, what is that going to mean for Europe? I'm concerned about that. What is the UK leaving the EU going to mean? I think it's, as I said, it's a loss for the EU. In our area of security, I think it's a big loss in terms of expertise and know-how and professionalism and so forth. I think the UK will lose as well, but it's not good for them either. But it's the security issues. I think a lot of the people who in the security EU level security agencies, a lot of these people were from the UK, and maybe not Frontex, but other agencies, or but certainly in Europol. So I think it's a loss. So the division thing's interesting because this has been going on, as you will recall, for years. I mean, President Bush tried to divide Europe. Remember, there was this talk about old Europe and new Europe, and so this has been going on. This is not sort of new, right? So I think at the very least, the U.S. president could call for more unity in Europe rather than play into European divisions. I don't know if Slovenia matters very much for what Americans think about us, but we're other countries that were maybe, I mean, no slight, it's a beautiful country, and but it's just not a large country. But if larger countries that are more well known in the U.S. Start saying the same thing, criticizing the U.S., if the EU as a whole starts criticizing the U.S. even more, I think that that could matter. It certainly matters on on the global stage, because I think Europe will stop waiting for America. I think Europe is kind of just waiting. Is this an aberration? Is this just something the Americans got drunk and we had 4 years of Trump, and now they're in the morning they're going to be their old self again. I mean, the old self wasn't great, but it's better than it's been. Or is this the new America that we're going to have to deal with, right? I mean, and if certainly if President Trump gets reelected, I wouldn't blame the rest of the world for thinking, all right, this is the new America now, and we should stop waiting for the U.S. To come back. We should prepare to disengage. We should prepare for a Europe without NATO, perhaps, or at least an American role in NATO, the same as it has been. I think all this plays into Russia's hands, right? All this division plays into Russia's hands. To me, it seems, the one strategy that Russia has had through all of this, whether we're talking about the United States over the past 5 years or so, or whether we're talking about Europe over the same time period, is just sow division, Whenever Europe's divided, it's good for Russia. Whenever America's divided, it's good for Russia. It really doesn't matter kind of what the division is about, as long as there's division, as long as there's polarization. So I think that President Putin's got to be very pleased with what he's, seeing in Europe these days and what he's seeing in the United States these days. And nevertheless, I would say you may know I'm still generally optimistic about European integration. I think a lot of the foreign policy elite in Europe still value it quite a bit. Have a lot invested in it, are not ready to cast it aside. I think a lot of observers here in the United States, when Europe was going through the Euro crisis in the 2000s, and then when Europe was going through the most serious phase of its migrant and refugee crisis in 2015, 2016, a lot of Americans, and then with Brexit, a lot of Americans were ready to say, well, clearly the EU is going to fold now. It's going to collapse. It's all over with. And I was always one that would say, no, if you look at the long history of the EU, a lot of countries have a lot invested in this. And it's really part of their foreign policy culture to be integrated and to be European and to work with other countries, Germany included, I would say, and even in France, two of the countries have to really take the lead now. So I am still optimistic that Europe can continue to muddle through, as sometimes it has to. As it's grown, it's really been the only way, muddling through. It's been harder for it to be bolder as it's become bigger and more diverse. It certainly has not helped that some countries seem to be backtracking on their consolidation of their democracies. It's sad that we even have to discuss this. I'm kind of surprised by it, actually. I'm reassured when I see people on the streets of Europe protesting, if they see their government backtracking, just as I hope that Europeans are reassured when they see Americans protesting, that not all Americans are happy with the present situation. So we're a very divided country right now, and I think we will be. No matter how this election turns out, I hope that European observers know that there are plenty of Americans who are dissatisfied with how things have been going and do want things to change, and are looking for ways to do that. Turning on in the election, I think, is a first step, but there's a lot to do, and I think we'll get closer to that with a Biden presidency than a Trump presidency. That's for sure.
Thank you, John. So there were a few comments in the chat box related to foreign policy. So some of us are wondering, what do people know about foreign policy? What do people know about the big geopolitical questions? So what are the thoughts in the general public about the relationship with China, the relationship with Russia? So I was wondering whether you could say perhaps a bit more about that. So in the general public, and then in terms of how you think Biden or Trump would deal with these challenges in the future.
Yep. So first of all, I would just direct your students to they can Google it right now while I'm talking, to the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations. So many American cities, even a middle-sized city the size of Buffalo, has a local council on foreign relations. Well, the one in Chicago is quite famous and quite large. And every year they publish public opinion data on what Americans think about foreign policy issues. So I would say if you want detailed information and you want to go back and track the data, visit the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations site, and you can have a lot of your questions answered. It's really very good, and often the leader of that organization is a prominent ex politician or governmental official. So recently, it's been one of my former professors at the University of Maryland, Ivo Daalder, whose father was a political scientist in the Netherlands. He was my professor then in the 90s at the University of Maryland. Then he worked in the Clinton administration. he became NATO ambassador, I think, yes. And then he, you know, when then the Trump years, then he moved into leading the Chicago Council. So what do Americans think? Well, as I mentioned, you know, first of all, it's not high on their agenda. So the most recent study that Chicago Council did looked at what Republicans think and what Democrats think, and foreign policy was just not very high on their list of things that they care about. I do think that Americans many Americans still want us to be involved as leaders, but again, we're very divided on this. I think there is growing sentiment of I don't want to call it isolationism, but of retreating, you know, protecting our sovereignty. I think it's a similar trend you see in some places in Europe, more a skepticism of being fully engaged in international institutions. And so there are more Americans that are sort of buying this than before. You know, but mostly I think it's still true that the American public is disinterested, sad to say, unless the US is directly involved. You know, unless we are, you know, if you look at American news these days, you would think that everything is just fine now in Syria and Iraq. I'm sure it is. I mean, because if you get your news from CNN, you get the impression, well, everything is settled there now. Good thing, you know, good thing that's all cleared up, you know, because it's just not discussed. It's not even covered. As far as I think President Biden's foreign policy will be similar to President Obama's foreign policy, with the difference that there'll be more attention paid to Russia than President Obama did when he first took office, as I mentioned earlier. I think that's a big change. I think there was some optimism that there could be, you know, we could work with Russia on some issues such as terrorism, perhaps. And I don't think anybody's under any illusion now about what's going on there and Russia's involvement. And I think that's a change. So it'll be like the Obama administration, but with more attention to Russia. I think if I could say one positive thing about President Trump, I would say that he's probably made the country more cautious about its relationship with China. You know, on the one hand, China is a major trading partner of the U.S. It holds a lot of our debt. They have some economic leverage over the United States, that's for sure. But I think on the other hand, I think President Trump has probably been correct to sort of cast them more as an adversary than as a partner. And I think that will find its way even into a Biden presidency as well. So this means, I think that because of the threat of Russia, I think a Biden presidency will pay more attention from the outset to Europe than President Obama did, even though at the same time the China threat is even greater than before, I would say. If President Trump should win, I'm still looking at my TV, by the way, just behind the computer screen here, and there's been no change in the vote, the electoral map. Well, I'll give you an update on how the races have tightened. Glanced at that. But if President Trump should win, boy, I think, you know, his tough stances on trade are only going to increase. I think the chance of any kind of a new trade agreement with Europe, or new trade and investment agreement with Europe, you know, really going to be dim. I mean, I think he will try to embrace the UK, and probably vice versa, especially if there's a no deal Brexit. You know, I think an even tougher stance on border control, tougher stance on well, you know, let the migrants and the refugees from Central America stay in Mexico, it's kind of oddly similar to some voices in Europe that are saying, let the migrants and refugees stay in Turkey. They'll be just fine there. They don't need to come here. There's some similarities there. The rhetoric will only increase. America's soft power will be almost completely gone, I would say. Any kind of investment in public diplomacy will go away. Yeah, I would be very pessimistic. I mean, the only thing that would give me reason to sort of keep the faith would be knowing that, again, as I've said, in the State Department, in the FBI, in the military, there are reasonable, educated people who are going to act professionally. So even if we get another 4 years of President Trump, you still have plenty of people in positions of influence and authority in the United States who are going to try their best to do the right thing. This is why I'm not really worried at all about if President Trump decides to not leave the White House or something should he lose, because especially now after he looked like he tried to give the Secret Service COVID, I think even the Secret Service now would probably usher him out, because he seemed to disregard their well-being and their family's well-being, and how he acted after he had COVID and then went back to the White House without a mask on and so forth. So I have some confidence still. I know some of these people personally, so maybe that's why. Perhaps that makes me biased. I don't know. Either makes me an expert or makes me biased. I'm not sure. But I know former students who have been in the military or are in the military. I know former students who are in the Department of Homeland Security. I've got a pretty good contact / friend, who I'm talking about, in the Department of Homeland Security, who's going to be the new DHS attaché in Brussels, by the way. I know people in the FBI personally. I have faith in these people as reasonable people who are going to do the right thing, and follow the law and follow the Constitution. So even if President Trump is elected, I don't think it's going to be easy for him to be destructive. I think the rhetoric will definitely continue and intensify, but the actual outcome of the rhetoric, I think, will be tempered by these reasonable people.
Thank you, John. So there was a question asking, I think you've touched briefly upon that, but perhaps you could say a little bit more, asking about the impact of having a divided government, so not having, the Democrats dominating all the institutions or vice versa. So how do you think this kind of split within the government is going to play out when it comes to foreign policy?
Yeah, so this is a normal feature of our system, naturally. Whenever I teach about comparative government, I teach a comparative government course as well to undergraduates. And whether I'm talking about electoral systems or systems of federalism versus unitary states or devolution or something, regional autonomy or what have you, or governmental systems, parliamentary versus presidential or semi-presidential, I'm always talking about advantages and disadvantages. So I would never say that one system is necessarily in all regards better than the other. I always would say, here's the advantages, here's what this system does well, here's what it doesn't do well. And then, you make up your own mind. But it gives, I think, students some food for thought about critically analyzing their own system. I've already mentioned, I think that Congress tends to stay out of the president's way when it comes to foreign policy. And it's because voters don't care about it that much. It's because it's difficult. It's especially difficult without if the Senate is the same party as the president, because the Senate has more foreign policy power than the House. Because of its treaty-making powers. But in the end of the day, both houses need to agree on a budget to fund foreign policy, and then the president has to agree with this. So we could be seeing another government shutdown. I don't think it would be about foreign policy, but it could affect foreign policy, that's for sure. I think the president will increasingly especially if it's President Trump, bypass Congress when it comes to making appointments of cabinet level officials by simply naming people to be interim secretary of this or that, and that he doesn't even have to go to Congress to get that approval. So I think if President Biden is elected, at least I think he'll return to the normal way of doing things, which is cabinet officials will go before the Senate. And I think the Senate still being under Republican control will, give his appointees a hard time, naturally. And it's kind of their job. But in the end, I think they will do what they used to do, which was to give them a hard time and then approve them if they're, unless there's something completely outrageous about them. Occasionally you find, the filling of ambassadorships to be held up by the Senate for completely political reasons that have nothing to do with the ambassador's qualifications and so forth. Speaking of this, I haven't talked about this yet, but I've been embarrassed by some of the ambassadors that we have sent to Europe and some of the things that they have said. So one of the things I'd be looking forward to under President Biden would be a better face for the United States in Europe physically, in terms of who are the ambassadors to the EU, to Germany, to other countries. Now, your students might know that the way that you can become an ambassador really in two ways in the US. You can work your way up through the State Department, through the Foreign Service, and get the rank of ambassador and actually become an ambassador to a country, or just get the title of ambassador if you're responsible for a policy issue. And many people do this. Or you can be a rich person and donate to a campaign or organize a $10,000 a plate luncheon as a fundraiser. And that's also how you get to become an ambassador. And this happens with both political parties. And so it's not like President Trump is the first president to do this. President Obama did the same thing. The trouble is, it seems that some of the people that President Trump has sent to Europe have said some very outrageous things, and completely, doing the opposite of what an ambassador should do, in fact. So I really hope that at least that changes. I know that there's substance and then there's style, but if soft power matters, then style matters too. So it would certainly help if we had more reasonable sounding, rich political donators as ambassadors in Europe, rather than the crazy ones that I think that President Trump has sent over in recent years. I look forward to that,
Thank you, John. Christian, did you have any follow-up question?
I can think of some, but I thought maybe you go through the list so that everybody gets the chance to ask their question.
Yeah, I can certainly do that. So coming back to perhaps more domestic issues. So you mentioned, and I think a lot of people found that a very interesting thought. So if I understood well, you said in a sense, one of the challenges now is that there could be a lot of people who are potentially dissatisfied and could engage in violent activities. So you seem to say that will be a challenge for the FBI in the years to come. So do you think that might lead to an increase in surveillance? And how do you think that people are going to feel about having perhaps their freedoms curtailed in the name of, addressing verbal and possible physical violence?
Yeah, that's a very good question. First, I would say that one of the reasons why it's going to be harder for U.S. law enforcement and security agencies to deal with this problem is that you're dealing with American citizens on American soil. And there are many more limitations that in theory and in practice that I think U.S. law enforcement follow when you're dealing with those kinds of terrorist threats. When you're dealing with a terrorist threat that comes from a person who might not be a citizen and may have more connections abroad, I think they are much more likely, as we've seen under not only President Trump, but under President Obama, President Bush before him, to push the envelope when it comes to the law, and it's taken the the leaks of Snowden and others, to sort of show us what was really going on, and people continue to push that envelope, but that dealt with a threat that was at least in part foreign in nature. And I think the FBI is much more cautious when it comes to dealing with Americans on American soil, and I think they take their constitutional limitations much more seriously. They are an organization that's built on arrests for the purpose of prosecutions, and they know that if they break the law to make an arrest, that they cannot in the end use that evidence, they cannot get a prosecution. Whereas the CIA or the NSA, for example, they're not concerned about this. So they're just concerned about using whatever means they can, pushing that envelope to deal with the threat. And they're not worried about evidence being inadmissible because it was obtained illegally. So I am actually not quite as worried about their surveillance increasing because of the militia threat for that reason. On the other hand, I would say that should there be a very horrible attack, then I think a lot of Americans, like they were after 9/11, would be more open to this sort of thing, and maybe not look as closely at the liberties that they might be giving up if the laws were to change, for example. But short of that, I think the FBI will follow the law, and I think that's what makes their job difficult, because they are limited in terms of what they can do here in ways that, say, the CIA and the NSA are not limited in terms of how they are, tracking people and tracking people's, email messages and phone calls and so forth, right? I think the FBI is a very different sort of mindset when it comes to this. So I'm worried about the threat because I know that the FBI will kind of have one hand tied behind its back, but I think that's what you get in a democracy. I really don't. I don't see, and I don't see the militia threat getting a lot worse at president. I suppose if President Trump is elected and the militia gets emboldened and there are some kinds of attacks, then his Justice Department could potentially try to put pressure on the FBI, which is contained within it. So that it is a little worrisome. But under President Biden, I think that we'll have a better respect for the rule of law, and I think that will limit it somewhat. But I think all law enforcement agencies love their toys. They love their technology, and so if there's the ability to use a toy that looks like a tank, this is what a local police agency will roll out when there's a demonstration, which is, often not the case, or not the best thing to do, I should say. And if there's some sort of surveillance tool, the FBI might be tempted to use it. But a lot of what the FBI does is human intelligence. I mean, they build relationships with people. They have informants. This is how they broke up this kidnapping ring, not too long ago. They had an informant, and it was done, within the law. So I think there's potential for the militia threat to be met this way. But as I said, it's not going to be easy to identify a community of people that meets at a particular mosque, that looks a particular way, that lives in a particular neighborhood. It's not going to work that way, and that makes it harder. It would be as if, what if there was a perceived terrorist threat from anybody of Latin American descent in the United States? How would we handle that with so many people in that category living everywhere in the U.S.? That I think we're going to be coming closer to that now with this militia threat, because the enemy, so to speak, is going to look like us. It's going to live where we live. And how do you deal with that and still protect your liberties at the same time? I think this is what makes the challenge in Europe so difficult, is that the current terrorism threat, and there's limits on what can be done, and what you're just going to have to sort of learn to live with, I guess, unfortunately, if you want to have some liberty, some freedom, you know. I mean, what you can tell me? I mean, recently there's been a couple of attacks in Europe now, just recently. So what's been their immediate reaction there? Is there been calls to do more than what's already being done? Because there's already quite a bit being done. There's already quite a bit of surveillance, say in France, and powers being exercised and so forth. So what's been going on there? I've been caught up in my crazy election over here, so I have not been reading my political.eu or my EU Observer as much as I would like to over the last few days. So what's going on over there? Tell me.
Oh, well, I think that there hasn't been one specific answer, because there have been attacks that are close in time, but they are actually quite different in nature and in terms of the perpetrators, whether you're talking about people whom were known to the security services or not. So it's not entirely clear. Like in one case, there's someone who had basically just arrived in France before committing the attack. So you can't really blame the security services for not having known.
Was that the attack in Nice? You mean that person?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So I think you're going to have different. The impact is not really clear because they're actually quite different. The
attack in Vienna the other day. I mean, what was that?
Well, that is an interesting one in the sense that it's someone who was really known to the security services and who had been released beforehand. He had been considered not to pose a threat anymore. So that's going to be those are quite different cases, but it will be really interesting to see.
Yeah, I remember, the Vienna attack, I have to say, reminded me of my student days. And I mean, as an American coming to Europe for the first time in the 1980s, I remember being in the middle of Vienna, and I remember being near the Central Synagogue and being so kind of impressed to see a soldier there with a machine gun. And this is something that, by then Europeans had been used to after a period of terrorism of various kinds starting in the 70s. But for me as a young American, I remember seeing this and being like shocked in a way, like, oh my goodness, there's a soldier on the street with a machine gun standing in front of that synagogue. I was almost like looking around, like, should I be worried? And now, one of the last times I was in Europe, that's kind of was the scene, after the attacks in France and in Brussels, when I was just seeing things in Paris and in Antwerp and in Brussels that I never seen before again. And I hope that Europe isn't headed back to those days again now after these attacks. So I hope that we're not headed in this direction in the United States. So we will see.
Mm-hmm. So there was a question, something we haven't really touched upon yet, well, at least not explicitly. So a question about your thoughts on the QAnon movement and its increasing popularity, and also the influence it has on US politics.
Well, yeah, I'm just I'm amazed. I mean, I just don't. I'm worried about it, like I'm worried about all the conspiracy theories and groups. It's just shocking that Americans could be buying into this. I mean, it's not the only country. I mean, there's even some Europeans are buying into the movement as well. It's just amazing that this has any traction in this day and age. And I am, increasingly supportive of social media platforms limiting what is posted on their sites. And the way I look at it is this: And for your students who are younger, this is the joke I tell, so bear with me. I'm going to be sarcastic here, so I hope this comes across. So there used to be something called the newspaper that people would read. And what it was made of was in the name, paper. And you used to have to open it up, and you know, it would blow away in the wind sometimes. And it was very impractical. And they probably have these in museums in Wales or in England. I think you can go look at them, I think, these newspapers. You know, so nowadays everything is, you know, on your screen there. But one handy thing about these newspapers was that when you opened them, when you looked at them, you knew that the top story was on the front page and it was above the fold. So that was handy to know what the top story of the day was. And when you opened up the newspaper, the first page of the newspaper was usually what the editors of the newspaper had to say about what was going on in the world or in the country that day. So that was easy to spot. The editorials were easy to spot physically in the newspaper. And then there was also something on this page, and I think this is true in Europe as well. I recall reading these old newspapers a lot when I was in Europe. There was something called letters to the editor. People would write letters, actually pick up pen and paper sometimes and write a letter and send it to the newspaper about their thoughts about whatever was going on in their community or in the world, or what the editors of the newspaper had to say the previous week or what have you. And they would get thousands of these, you know, hundreds of these letters, let's say, would come into these newspapers all the time. Now, these days, people just type these outrageous comments at the bottom of news stories, and that's kind of, they get that off their chest and that's it. But back in the days of letters to the editor, the newspapers would get a lot of these letters and they would not print every letter. If somebody said something crazy, something totally false, they would not be, that letter would not be printed. And if people weren't happy about that, they'd have to find another newspaper, the Weekly World News, the National Enquirer, whatever, some tabloid that maybe would print their crazy letter. And so I think that social media platforms should treat posts the same way. That, as you know, not everything should be allowed to be on social media platforms. And I do not find that to be a form of censorship. I find that to be the same as in the old days when newspapers would pick and choose about which letters of the editor deserve space that day in the paper. Because I think that these social media platforms, when they let anything be posted, anything be circulated, are simply fueling these conspiracy theories, fueling these movements that are based on myths and untruths, etc. And if people don't like it, then find your own social media platform, and then you can post anything you want there. Just like in the old days, people have to find their newspaper that they liked. But you know, I think it's perfectly proper now for social media platforms to limit what's the content. And it's a business. It's a business like a newspaper is a business, and you don't have a right to put anything on there. It's not, it'd be different if the government gets involved and starts telling social media what they can put on there or not. That's a press freedom issue. But as long as the social media organizations are doing this themselves because they think it's for the common good, I think that's perfectly fine. And I think more of it needs to happen.
So what would you say to those saying, isn't that restricting freedom of speech?
No. I think it's the same. It would be different if the government gets involved. Yes. If the government is telling the social media platforms what to restrict, yes. If it is just Twitter doing it, or if it's just Facebook doing it, or Instagram doing it, or TikTok, or whatever, that's fine. It's a business. I mean, after all, you know, they're collecting our data because it's a business. And they're selling the data. And that's why some people don't go onto these pages. It's not because they don't want to get in arguments with their friends or see pictures of their friends' kids or flowers, like in my case, so apologies. But it's because they don't want their data to be, you know, scooped up and used later on, right? It is a business, it's a private entity, and if you don't like it, you can found your own social media platform and post all you want. But I like to compare it to a letter to the editor. And newspapers, you know, the Times, the Guardian, you know, Financial Times, they didn't print every letter to the editor that showed up. they didn't feel an obligation to print everything that someone had to say. So why should Facebook or Twitter feel obligated to allow people to post anything that they want? I mean, they should make some choices about what's reasonable. What do our readers need to know? What points of view? Okay, they may be different than my point of view, but what point of view is a reasonable one that someone should hear about, someone should read about? But if they post something that's, they would never post a letter that says, like a flat earthers existed, back 20 years ago. They would never post a letter by somebody that says, there's a dome over the earth and it's flat, and but yet on social media you can post things about that all the time, and nobody cares, and that's pretty innocuous. But then when you get into QAnon and other conspiracy theories, that's really dangerous stuff. So what I believe that the social media platform should exercise their civic responsibility to limit what's posted, as long as it's not the government that is setting the rules about what is proper and not. And if people don't like it, they can find another social media platform.
Thank you, John. And then that will probably be the last point that we discuss, as it's nearing the end already. Doesn't feel like it, but it's been, it's been quite a long discussion already, but yeah. Really interesting question. So we talked a little bit about the far right earlier. So is there any sign of possible infiltration or influence of the far right or right-wing forces in the security establishment in the US, in the way we have seen, for example, in Germany recently? You've probably followed that.
I'm sure that there is. I mean, I have no firsthand knowledge of this. I think it is more of a problem at the local level and local police forces than it is at the level of the FBI. Again, I really have a lot of respect for the FBI and the high standards that they have for who gets in and the training and how they conduct themselves. I mean, I've kind of seen this. I've talked to people about this. But I think for sure there are, and I think this is part of the problem with our policing in the US, is we have not been as careful as we have needed to be in terms of who becomes a police officer, who has the right disposition to be a police officer, and the kind, I think they're underserved in terms of training. I think one of the problems that we've experienced is not just maybe racist views among some police officers, it's just the lack of training and experience. I mean, a country like France, for example, I mean, it's a very common thing to have demonstrators. It's a very common thing for people to yell things at the police. And, of course, the police aren't perfect anywhere, but, the police there know how to handle it. They know, okay, this can go one of two ways. I can hit this person over the head and then all hell's going to break loose here. Or I can simply stand here behind my shield and just kind of smile at the person. And then in a few hours, everybody's going to go home, whereas in the US, I think these police officers, some of them have never encountered this before. They don't know how to handle it. Some of them have, we've been at war as a country now for 20 years. We have a lot of military veterans who have a different mindset when it comes to conflict situations. Now that can cut two ways. On the one hand, you could have a person who is not going to panic when things start to get dangerous or things start to get hectic. They're going to keep their heads and they're going to, do their job. So you want those people. But on the other hand, you could have people, and I think we have some of these people as well in the police force, who are going to kind of revert to their military mindset, which is to look at the people across from them who are doing the shouting and doing the throwing from the back row as their opponents, their enemies, rather than fellow citizens, And so I think that's part of the problem as well, is who is in our police force these days. There's a lot of veterans. And some of the veterans are ideal, I think, because they can handle the stress and they can handle the tension and the danger. And, you know, if I were a police officer, I'd want to be working with somebody like that in a dangerous situation. But there are also, I'm sure, people who just do not have the right disposition, and it may be a little psychologically damaged from their experience in the war. And I don't think we have vetted those people out of our police force enough. And I don't think we give them enough training. A lot of the problem with the police in the US, and, you know, some of your, you know, students are been probably paying attention to this, they already know this, but the police unions control a lot of this in the US. And they dictate, you know, who can be, when training can happen, and whether or not people should be paid overtime for training. You know, in a lot of cities that are having these problems, they don't have any money. So in order to have training, you need to actually pay the police officers overtime. They don't want to pay for that. So you end up with a lot of poorly trained police officers, some of them not of the right disposition, or they might have psychological issues even, some of that from the war. And on top of that, you do have, I think, some people who, you know, are racist and bring that to their job as well. So I think we need to do a better job with that. And I'm hoping that that's going to be one of the results of the election, as well as a real serious discussion about what to do with our police. You know, we haven't talked about that. I know it's sort of off topic, but certainly a big issue here. I'm not one for defunding the police. I tend to think that less money is not going to solve the problem. It's probably going to take more money, more training, higher salaries, more vetting to have a better, more professional police force here than not. So sorry if I got a little off topic there, but I think it's an important issue in the US. And I will give you an update now. I'm watching CNN out of the corner of my eye here. President Biden, or Vice President Biden, is holding his lead in Nevada slightly. He's holding his lead in Wisconsin. He had in the race in Michigan is a virtual dead heat now. The last time out of my corner of my eye I saw it, it was 0.2% separating the two. So he has caught all the way back up from early this morning U.S. time. All those votes all those absentee ballots that are being counted, most of those are coming in for Vice President Biden in Michigan. If you are hoping for change, then I think that's a good sign. So things are looking good in Wisconsin, trending well in Wisconsin, trending well in Michigan, trending well in Nevada so far. Arizona, Biden is now up by 4 points. So sun is still shining here in Buffalo. That's November day. So I'm going to be able to work in my flower garden today and get it ready for the winter that's definitely coming. But I hope that the winter is not coming when it comes to U.S. politics. Let's hope that we're going to have spring in January.
Thank you, John. I believe Christian has a few concluding words to offer.
Right. Well, John, thank you very much for being here today. I mean, just to connect with your update, it seems that if we were to stop counting the votes right now, we would have President Biden in the White House.
Yes. So maybe we should listen to President Trump and stop counting the voting.
But I suspect we are going to count all the votes now.
Ah, darn it.
And
democracy is so complicated.
Especially in Arizona. and so it was a great pleasure to have you here. I mean, we learned so much from you. I think, thank you very much for taking all this time to discuss all of the questions and to really give us a tour de force through US politics, US foreign policy, US security policy, geopolitics. And I think we've all learned a great deal. And just to give a little outlook, because we're going to have more talks, I can already give a little outlook on the 25th of November for all of you who are here. I hope to see you back on the 25th of November. We're going to have Professor Gabi Bendor from the University of Haifa here with us, and we are going to discuss terrorism and democracy. I think also a very, very important topic at this point in particular, and discuss the various experiences that Israel, that Europe, that the United Kingdom has had. So I hope that you will tune in again. And then from the 15th to the 17th of December, we're going to have the opening conference of our EU Counterterrorism Jean Monnet network. In fact, this is a network where we have 14 different universities from 11 different countries all coming together to discuss this. And in fact, we're going to have far more people there. It's shaping up as a really, really great event. So we will advertise it in due course when the program is a little bit clearer. And of course, we are extremely delighted to see John back then with us. And until then, thank you very much for having been here with us today. And I shall look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thank you all very much. And I thank your audience as well.
Thank you very much, John. That was great. Indeed, we made you cover a lot of ground. Thanks a lot to Joanna, who helped with all the logistics in the background, which was more challenging than we thought. But thank you so much. And thanks very much to all those of you who joined us today and asked really interesting questions. But big thank you again to John. And perhaps we will have you back in a few months' time once we have a clear idea of who is
my
in
pleasure.
The
It'd be my pleasure. That's one of the benefits of the new Zoom culture. I think people are more open to these kinds of webinars. And I think this is great for making connections among people who are ordinarily not in touch with each other. So I think that is a little bit of a silver lining to this terrible pandemic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, everyone. And we hope to see you all very soon.